We're coming down to the wire in Severance, Season 2, Episode 8, Sweet Vitriol. This was the shortest of the series so far, and with that, a little bit of a controversial episode, with it being the lowest rated on IMDb so far of the entire series. Although, with that said, we finally get to catch up with some much-needed Cobel after her being MIA for a while, and my god, do we get a reveal with her later in the episode. Hey guys, welcome back. This is Brad. This episode, I know it's a little bit of a controversial one. There's a lot of chatter about it not being so great, very slow. It was short. It is the lowest rated one on IMDb, as I mentioned in the intro, and I think it did leave a little bit to be desired. While we did get the big reveal about Cobel, that's kind of really all that this gave us. There are some other things sprinkled in here that I do want to talk about, and I'm going to do the whole overview for the episode, but I really wish we got some flashbacks of early Cobel through school, maybe some stuff about the ether mill, or maybe what Salt's Neck looked like beforehand. But essentially, we just get to see how much of a disaster that Salt's Neck turned out to be after Lumen kind of just ditched them. And then maybe even a little bit more about Salt's Neck, like what it used to look like, what it was when she was there as a kid, things like that. Overall, I think the episode was a little bit weak, which I know that's not really a hot take. I still really enjoyed it. I'm not hating on it by any stretch of the imagination, and there are some interesting points that I do want to speak about in the overview, and I'll do the little discussion that I do at the end where I talk about some of the key points that I picked up on in the episode. So without further ado, let's jump in. So we kick this episode off with Cobel driving through Salt's Neck. She finally returns, and immediately she hits a huge pothole, like as if she's driving through New England. Although we know that this is like a rundown town that Lumen has destroyed, I love this opening sequence of shots with the drone shots and the far shots. It just looks great. This was filmed in Newfoundland, Canada. This color grade and the dark blue and depressing nature of how everything looks is going to continue throughout the entirety of this episode. We don't get an intro on this episode, and we get the blank title card that says Severance on it, which is the exact same way that the Ortbo episode started out. We get our first look at this town and the nature of the people that are living there. While Cobel's brushing her teeth with the water bottle method, she looks over and sees a drug addict huffing ether. Between this and the cafe, we see that this town has just been completely run down by ether addiction, and it's all basically Lumen's fault. Now this is where we get our first look that Devin actually did call Cobel, and she's not going to stop, and she keeps calling a number of different times until Cobel actually picks up at the end of the episode. During this sequence where we're going to end up at the Drippy Pot Cafe, there's a song by Charles Bradley being played, Where Do We Go From Here? Pretty self-explanatory with just disappointment, hardship, struggles, confusion. Basically just, it's like an anthem for this rundown town, unfortunately. So before Cobel arrives, we see Hampton, who seems to be the owner of this Drippy Pot Cafe, and he's also an ether dealer. And we see him hand a bottle to one of his patrons, seemingly giving it this one on the house for free. But it's clear that he uses this business and also deals ether out of it as well. So Cobel shows up, and she walks in, takes a seat, and says, Harmony Cobel. Well, flip my toboggan, as if she's kind of answering for him. It's pretty clear that these guys have history, and we end up finding out that they were quote-unquote co-workers. But as he says later, they were child laborers, and they worked together at the ether factory. Hampton gives her a 1,000-yard stare here, and he's pretty unimpressed to see her, and he says that this is for paying customers only. We don't know the exact last time that Cobel's been here, but it's presumed to be a very long time, and it shows later that it's probably since she was a child, even. She says the town is older than she remembers, and it's frailer. Then Hampton drops this hilariously verbose sentence on us here about the town.
Yeah, well, with the market readjustment from a few years ago and the fluctuating interest rates, there was a retrenchment from some of the core infrastructure investments.
Everybody in this town is addicted to ether. They have respiratory issues. You can see that there's a woman in the diner that has oxygen on. It's just a sad place to be, and it's just been destroyed by Lumen. Cobel needs a favor, so she tells him to head to the Lumen factory, and they end up meeting there. On their way to the factory, there's a little cut of this red building on the left side that says, There is a cure for man, with the Lumen logo above it. This is all predating Severance, so the Lumen factories with the ether and everything, that's like the OG Severance. Ether is an anesthetic that induces like a dreamlike dissociative state where the awareness and pain fades away, so people use it to get high, but it also is considered a volatile anesthetic, so it can depress the central nervous system, and it actually can lead to unconsciousness as well. This, like I said, is like the OG Severance. And seeing that Lumen sign It kind of reminded me of something that Dr. Maurer said in the previous episode, where he says that Kier will take away Gemma's pain. Hampton and Cobel both meet at the old Lumen factory. Cobel needs a favor to drive her to Sissy's house, which is her aunt. She needs him to do it so she can arrive in secret and make sure that nobody's following them. Hampton says she lives by the 9. You know she's a fucking pariah here. And we know that that's a nod to the 9 core principles of Lumen. Cobel's trying to coax him to do it, and she says, "We were once old chums. Old colleagues lift each other up." He looks at her for a second, pauses, and says, "Old colleagues? Child fucking labor." And as I mentioned earlier, this is where we learn that they used to work together at the Lumen ether mill. Lumen is just using child labor in these factories, and we also later find out that at these ether factories, the children are just getting high off ether as well. Like, the evil in Lumen just runs so deep, and it's crazy that we hear that they're doing this stuff too. So Hampton does end up driving Cobel to her old house. She's bouncing around in the back of the truck, and we see that she gets another call from Devin here. When Cobel gets out, she tells Hampton that he's higher than a bearded vulture, and mentions that she can smell it on his breath. And she also mentions a couple of things about him, like dealing and all that, but it's kind of hilariously judgmental for somebody who later we're going to be seeing huffing ether on her dead mother's bed, but we'll get to that. Cobel rushes in real quick, and she goes up to her room, which is horribly drab. There's nothing in it other than what seems to be just like a little plushie of some sort. Her aunt sold everything to the poor, that she says, which is really weird considering you'd probably want to donate these things to people that are less fortunate, but she doesn't seem like she's somebody that would do something like that. While Cobel is in there, we get a look at the height markings on the wall when she was a child, and we see that it ends at age 12, which that's presumably when she ends up heading off to school. Cobel questions Sissy, asking if she's heard from anybody. She says that she's heard from Mr. Drummond, and he called looking for her to come back and for her to plead her forgiveness to the Egan's, and that they will grant it. I just can't imagine this is true. I feel like we had that scene where Cobel was kind of caught off guard with Helena and her chauffeur there. It just felt really weird, and they have to know that she invented it. I would be shocked if they don't know it to at least some degree. And I get that feeling because Cobel says to Helena there that they would be nothing without her. I feel like if anything, she knows too much, and they should be worrying about what she could do or what she might do. You know, they're after her in some way. And we do see at the end of this episode that before she does escape, that somebody's coming and looking for her at Sissy's house. Cobel's looking to get into her mother's room, and we get a line similar to that of what would be spoken by Milkshake or one of these other Lumen slaves.
"Why do you bring nothing but woe into my life?"
Cobel and her aunt have a little bit of a back and forth here over Cobel's mother, and Cobel takes a solid slap to the dome here from her aunt, saying that there was gratitude in her eyes to be freed from the suffering. So we know that Cobel went off to school as a young girl. She left her mother behind. Her mother was getting sick, and her health was declining. She really regrets not being around to help take care of her mother before she passed away. But there's something that I thought of here, and I don't know, we don't really have a big backstory on her mother or anything like that. There's not a whole lot of information told in this episode, but it makes me wonder if maybe she got respiratory problems because of the ether factories, or maybe she was also addicted to ether. And we do know that that causes a lot of respiratory issues. So, I mean, it only makes sense. Salt's Neck is an absolute mess, and it clearly has been for a long time. So it wouldn't shock me. It looks like there's a lot of people that are currently still living there that are going to face a similar road. Anyway, Cobel's aunt says that only if she, speaking about Cobel's mother, was a believer, that she could have found solace in the 9. Her mom was not a believer in Kier. She was not in the Lumen cult. So it's interesting here because Sissy is kind of explaining and talking about Cobel's mother as if she were in the wrong. She wasn't a follower of Kier. She didn't believe in the 9, any of that nonsense. But meanwhile, you have Hampton here on the other side, who's in a decaying town. Everything's gone to shit, and he's calling her the pariah. Like, Sissy is the outcast on the outside because she's this person that still believes in everything Lumen, everything Egan. Meanwhile, she just watches all this shit crumble beneath her feet. Also, at one point, the camera pans down to Sissy's hands, and she's like caressing this egg-shaped rock with like a painted face of Kier on it. It's just, these people are just so strange. Sissy's also dressed in that white dress that we see Cobel in a previous episode that she's praying to her Kier shrine, which we also find that Sissy has a Kier shrine as well. No surprise there. Cobel's rummaging through her aunt's stuff, looking for a key to her mother's room. We see this vertebrae. It looks like maybe a small baby whale, a seal, or a dolphin. And it's like atop all these cards that represent the core 9. She's still rummaging through all of her stuff, which she finds a picture of Kier. She pulls back, and there's something behind it that says, "You must be cut to heal," which Milchick says to Mark at the start of this season while they're walking through the halls of Lumen while he's carrying those balloons that he gave to Mark. So she ends up finding the key and rushing into her mother's room. She's looking around, and the camera zooms into an old picture of Cobel as a child, and it's the only picture in her room. And of course, the next natural thing to do is lay on your dead mother's bed with her breathing tube and plug it into her machine and then proceed to breathe through it for hours, of course. I mean, obviously Cobel's having a hard time coming to grips with her mother's death. She still regrets not being there for her when she was a kid, so she's kind of wallowing in this opportunity to be where she once was. She ends up laying there and falling asleep and ends up getting woken up by Hampton coming in and having a little argument with Sissy. He's been out there in the cold for hours, just hanging out in his truck. I was originally going to say respect to our boy Hampton for letting Cobel do her thing and just, decompress and be in her mother's room, but realistically, we knew that he's probably out there knocked out cold from ether anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Hampton comes up with a lantern into Cobel's mother's room, and this is kind of the only warmth or color we end up seeing effectively in this entire episode. The rest of the entire episode just gray, dark blues, black, extremely depressing, and this is just like an interesting kind of contrast that they add in as a splash with the light here. Hampton knows that Cobel's having a hard time, and he hates Lumen. He said he liked Cobel's mother, effectively just because she hated Lumen more than he does, so respect. So him and Cobel decide to huff some ether and get high. Cobel's flaming him again for his involvement with ether, even though she's here doing it with him. And this type of stuff just is so weird. It always pulls me away from the time frame. They're out here doing ether, carrying around lanterns for light. You wouldn't even know what time period this would be in. It's just so strange. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, this is where it was first said that they were 8 years old when they first were doing ether in the Lumen factories, and then Hampton makes a joke saying, "Ready to man the vats for 10 hours?" Anyway, they kiss while they're high on ether, but then that quickly changes gears, and then Hampton says that he doesn't think what she's looking for is in here. They end up heading outside and going into this little cave next to Sissy's house. There appears to be just a bunch of garbage, old ether bottles, and what Cobel's looking for actually is here. And this is where we start to unravel one of the biggest twists that I did not see coming from a mile away in this show. This was not on my Severance bingo card. But before we get into that, she finds an old book that's titled Myrtle Egan School for Girls, Annual Reminiscences. And this is kind of like their yearbook type thing. While she's opening it and flicking through it, that Kier song is playing that she sang previously and was humming while she was holding Devon's baby. We see from this book that Cobel is an extremely gifted student. She was the valedictorian of her class, and she also received the Wintertide Fellowship presented to her by James Egan. Now, before we get past this part, though, and talk about, her involvement with Severance and all that, I kind of want to speak on these two pages quickly. It's really difficult to make out this page where it has that little passage under her saying that she's valedictorian and going over her esteemed academics and stuff. But towards the bottom, what you can make out is it says something like she was the president of the Goat Husbandry Club, which I found extremely interesting. I don't know if anybody else is talking about this, but that is very clearly there, despite it only showing it for a brief period of time in a very, very barely visible, blurry kind of passage of text, but it's there. Now, obviously, the goats have been a part of the show, at least teased in multiple different ways, whether it's actually showing us the goats in season 1 and in season 2 so far. They don't really go into it, but there's goat heads and other references to goats all over the place. Obviously, everybody wants to know what this is all about, but I found it interesting to know that Cobel had something to do with the Goat Husbandry Club while she was at school, and that's a part of Lumen. And knowing that she created Severance, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. There's definitely something here. The second page is just talking about the Wintertide Fellowship. It talks about the Year of the Wiles, which is also mentioned on her Kier bust as well. It says it at the bottom of it, that obviously being one of the core 9 principles. So, I mean, this makes sense. She's been indoctrinated at such a young age. Her Kier shrine, her absolute dedication to Kier, the Egans, and everything. It makes sense. This is all a cult at the end of the day. But with that said, this part here is where that entire thing just starts to make even less sense, knowing how much she was taken advantage of by the Egans. And it's kind of weird too, like in this picture, she's standing next to James Egan, holding this bust of him, offering it to her as like a gift of her fellowship. I also don't think it's just by happenstance that we haven't heard anything about Cobel's dad. We have some sort of understanding about what happened to her mom, and we're uncovering some other things here, but we just still don't know anything about it. And I'm worried that we might find out something that her dad is actually James Egan. And I don't know the ages of what Cobel is or James. James Egan appears to be like pretty old and frail, but they seem, too close in age. But Lumen is and the Egans are just so weird that I wouldn't put it past them, but I don't know. And effectively, that wouldn't make Cobel and Helena sisters, which is extremely bizarre. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe her dad is a different Egan or something, but I think there's something strange here going on. Anyway, getting back on track here. So we see Cobel take these documents out of the James Egan bust that she was gifted. And this is where everything starts to unravel, that we find out that Cobel is the actual inventor of the Severance chip, which fucking blew my mind. Cobel now has exactly what she was looking for. She's on her way out, and she goes in and tells Sissy to cover for her effectively. Of course, with Sissy being brainwashed, she says that she would never lie to the Egans, and then Cobel says that Lumen destroyed this town and you owe them no loyalty. Her aunt takes the documents from Cobel, and she didn't realize that Cobel was actually the one behind this. She couldn't take credit for it because she would have been banished. She was so brainwashed as well that she effectively just gave the information over, saying that Kier's knowledge is for all. I mean, it makes so much sense now. I feel like rewatching this entire show this completely changes the perspective on everything. How she acts, why she's kind of watching over Mark, her ideas on reintegration, why she's like one of the only people that seem to believe in it, and why she had to go after Petey's chip to test it and make sure. There's a little scuffle on the way out. Right before Cobel leaves, Sissy tries to throw all of her stuff into the fire. Cobel says that, "I hope you die as painful of a death as she did," talking about her mom. Then right before she can leave, Sissy says that it was her hand that removed the tube. Cobel obviously doesn't want to believe it, and then Sissy says that her mom was full of resentment and malice. Hampton is honking, trying to get Cobel out of there because he sees somebody driving up to the house. Cobel rushes out, and we get this very Dylan-coded line here from Hampton, which is kind of hilarious.
Come tame these tempers, assholes.
Then right at the end here, Devon's still calling Cobel, but she's on her way out. She finally answers the phone. Devon tells her that Mark's been reintegrating, but they want to try to hatch a new plan. Cobel immediately fires back, saying that Ragabi hasn't killed him yet. She asks to put Mark on, and then the episode ends with her saying, "Tell me everything." Wow, what an ending to that episode. I honestly was not expecting that at all. I'm sure nobody was. That's just a massive surprise. It changes everything going forward for the rest of season 2, and I'm excited to see where it goes next. I know that this episode was the worst received. It's also the shortest episode, and I think a lot of that has to do with it's going to be tough following objectively the best episode in the entire series, the last one, the Gemma episode. Plus, this is just a really drab and depressing. I mean, it's intentionally filmed that way. The color grading is very dull and like dead feeling. Like it's just depressing. So I'm not hating on it. I still enjoyed it. I just feel like it left a bit to be desired. As I mentioned before, I feel like if we got some Cobel flashbacks, maybe Cobel at school, maybe her early involvement with Lumen, maybe some things about the ether mill, things like that, just to improve and get a little bit more of the Cobel lore. And speaking of lore, we also, like I mentioned in the breakdown, we get that little passage that was under her valedictorian picture, and it mentioned the Goat Husbandry Club. So something with goats has always been in this Lumen Kier universe, and there's always hints or little Easter eggs with these goats, so I don't know where that's gonna go, but every single time it pops up, it makes me more and more curious. So I just want to talk briefly about a couple things. There's not a whole lot to go into that I didn't already cover in the breakdown, but I want to talk about Cobel and Lumen. She was obviously wrapped up in this huge Kier cult. Since she was a kid, she was indoctrinated. She's been involved with it pretty much her whole life, and we only are just now seeing the tides turn of her kind of wanting to take her achievements back and regain her pride. Kier and Lumen and the Egans got all the credit for her amazing achievements, so it only makes sense that she wants to kind of get back at them. Her meeting up with Hampton and seeing how mentally ill Sissy is because she's so deep into this cult. And, you know, they say that her mom hated Lumen so much. Hampton really hates Lumen, and he liked Cobel's mom because he knows that she hated Lumen more than he does. So just being around all this almost probably proves more to her that this is the end of the line for her in terms of her involvement with this Kier cult, and she is just going to go in with Mark into Lumen guns ablaze. I'm so excited to see what happens. But with that said, at the end of the episode, somebody's clearly got a close watch on her. If they already showed up there, she was probably at Sissy's house for, you know, a reasonable amount of time, handful of hours, and there was already somebody coming after her in Salt's Neck. So we don't know if Sissy called somebody. I know that Cobel like ripped the phone off out of the wall, and it makes sense why they have a close watch on her. She knows more than anybody about the Severance chip, obviously, because she created it. She's a liability potentially because of how much she knows if Lumen is worried that she might go rogue and go against them. Or maybe they just need her, honestly. With her vast knowledge of the Severance chip and just being a part of Lumen since she was a child, like the amount of experience she has there, probably just far more than the average person that works there. And I'm sure they need her more than we're even aware of. And it's only just now becoming apparent to us because of this, you know, information drop that we got effectively. This also explains Cobel's obsession with reintegration. You know, she was one of the only people that seemed to believe in it. Natalie didn't believe in it. The board didn't believe in it. And she obviously harvests Petey's chip right out of his head, right at his funeral, of all places. They do some testing on it. It comes back, and then Grainer says that it was full synaptic recoupling, aka reintegration. So going back and thinking more about the happenings in season 1 and 2, her obsession with Mark, and her knowing that Gemma is on the testing floor, it all starts to kind of make sense now. And I know I theorized this a couple episodes ago that they would probably work together, especially where we hadn't seen Cobel in a little while. It's not the most groundbreaking theory ever. I know a bunch of people had been talking about it, but I'm excited to see where it goes now. Mark has his own reasons to go after Lumen, and then you have Cobel with an equal set of reasons to go after them. And I think both of them working together is going to be interesting. But it makes me wonder where Ragabi falls into all of this. She was a very mysterious character to me, and it seems like Cobel doesn't trust that she's good at doing reintegration, likely because she just doesn't know as much as Cobel about the Severance chip. But I was always kind of curious if Ragabi would end up coming out that she was almost kind of using Mark for, like, as a pawn in her own game because she needed to get something out of Lumen. There's still a lot of curiosity there, and I wonder if we're going to get some sort of reveal with her. But at this point, I think it realistically is only just Mark and Cobel. You can't, with him being fully reintegrated at this point, he can't trust Helly anymore. Even though he knows effectively that Helly and Helena are two different people, it's such a liability for him to put any trust in Helly when Helena's already infiltrated the severed floor pretending to be Helly. So I think it's effectively just going to be those two. Dylan's got his own thing going on with Gretchen. I wonder if we'll even touch back on that before the end of season 2, but it truly is most likely just going to be them two taking them down. And the next episode is called After Hours, so it's pretty easy to theorize that they're probably going to try to crack some plan for them to go in when Lumen's at its quietest, and then the ending episode in the series is Cold Harbor. So I couldn't be more excited to see what happens next. I really do wish we got a little bit more out of this episode, but I'm happy with the reveal that we got. It changes so many different things, and I'm so excited for next week. I can't wait until Thursday already. So if you guys watched this far, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Leave a like if you like, leave a comment. Let me know what you guys thought of this episode. Did you like it? Did you hate it? But yeah, with that said, I'll see you guys later in the week. Bye.